All the previous lectures, in essence, gave an answer to the question in an implicit form, posed by Diogenes more than 2000 years ago. What is a normal human? The determination of the answer to this question makes it possible to determine the understanding of many other social phenomena which, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, are connected with the essence of man. In particular, it allows one to answer the question, what is fascism? Umberto Eco wrote an article which he called Eternal Fascism, in which he names 14 features of fascism. Another scientist, Lawrence Britt, also analyzed fascism, also named 14 characteristics of fascism. However, they do not coincide with each other. And, in fact, it turns out that fascism, as a social phenomenon, has eluded the understanding of both, simply for the simple reason that fascism has many faces, and to answer the question, what is it, without determination in the question, what is a normal human, is impossible. The most general definition of fascism is the assertion that fascism is a system of misanthropy and anti-humanness. But when detailing this answer, the concretics are different, depending on what we mean by the essence of man. According to what was stated in the previous lectures, the anti-humanness of fascism is expressed in the fact that a human, as a carrier of the human structure of the psyche, from the point of view of fascism, is an antisocial phenomenon, and the essence of fascism is that this culture, aimed at ensuring that a society in which everyone achieves a human type of psyche structure by the beginning of adolescence, does not take shape. But there is also liberalism. Liberals believe that they are anti-fascists, and fascists are all others who disagree with liberals. The reality, though, is such that the essence of liberalism is in the fact that in response to the question, what is a normal human? It says that there is no norm as such, and norms are a limitless diversity, limited by nothing except that legislation, which is directed at protecting this limitless diversity from the inclinations towards any totalitarianism. It seems that one can agree, but there are a number of accompanying circumstances. In life, there are processes of development and degradation. The processes of development and degradation are distinguishable only if there is some kind of idea of what the norm is. If the reality is such that society is far from the norm, then development is a change in society in the direction of the norm, and degradation is a further departure of society from the norm. And accordingly, if the concept of the norm is determined erroneously, but nevertheless, the cognitive creative potential is not blocked, then in the process of development, society will come to the correct understanding of the norm, and the norm will be realized, incarnated into life. And if there is a fundamental reluctance to answer the question, what is a normal human, and to hide behind an infinite diversity, then in this limitless diversity, there is a place for both degradational and developmental processes. So it turns out that rolling downhill is always easier than climbing. Degradational processes. This is rolling downhill. Therefore, it turns out that liberalism is a kind of fascism, in the sense that liberalism impedes the formation of a human culture, not by holding back the development of people and the development of society by any totalitarianism, but by rejecting the norm. The understanding of what a normal human is opens the widest gates for degradational processes, as a result of which society eventually rolls into the process of biological degeneration and has the prospect of ending its existence, yielding its habitat to other societies, carriers of a different culture. This is what is happening now in the USA, in Europe. This is exactly what I said. That is, liberalism opens the widest gates for the penetration of degradational processes into society. This process is not spontaneous, however, but purpose-orientedly governed, for the simple reason that for those who are sometimes called the world behind the scenes, liberal bourgeois society, capitalism on a liberal basis, is presented as a danger, because it's the generator of a consumption race without meaning and benefit, and accordingly, it is the generator of the global biospheric ecological crisis, which is developing towards the complete destruction of the currently existing biosphere. Therefore, if we talk about the creation of a bright future for all mankind, then there is a need to govern many processes. And in order to govern processes, and govern processes not alone, but in collective activity, we need a theory of governance that would allow representatives of different professions and different spheres of activity to come to an understanding in their collective activities, to properly organize stable processes of governance, to enter into existing processes of governance, and give them a certain directionality. If one does not talk about collective activity, then a theory of governance is not needed. If someone believes that his mission is to be a little person, to do everyday things, and not to interest himself in global problematics, not to be responsible either for the country, for his enterprise, or for the planet as a whole, then he also does not need a theory of governance. Well, for those who are not satisfied with the way the country and mankind live, who want their children and grandchildren to live in a better world than our ancestors and ourselves lived, a theory of governance is needed. By now, there are many theories of governance. Some of them are of a purely applied character. The theory of governance towards aircraft, theories of control of some machines and mechanisms. Cybernetics claimed to be a general theory of governance. A book called Cybernetics was published in 1948. Logically, if this is really classical, fundamental work, which laid the foundation for a whole direction of science, then the question arises, why has the work of Norbert Wiener never been studied in higher educational institutions? According to the logic of things, students, at least students in the specialty cybernetics, should get acquainted with the fundamental works.
Я правильно помню, что кибернетика, как и Евгеника, у нас была запрещена в позднем СССР?
Cybernetics was not actually banned. Cybernetics, at the time of its appearance, was characterized as a pseudoscience. If you understand what processes of governance are and read Wiener's book, then you can come to the conclusion that this characteristic of cybernetics as a pseudoscience was not absurd, for the simple reason that everyone who takes the time to read cybernetics will learn a lot of interesting facts from it, many interesting thoughts, but to form one's own views on what the process of governance is in general, and how to transform this in general into the concretics of governance in its life circumstances, this is impossible to do on the basis of cybernetics. In the USSR, there was the Institute of the Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Problems of Governance. Along with this, there were several institutes of cybernetics. If we turn to our history, then in Russia, everything connected with the theory of governance goes back to the works of Vishnegradsky. Then there was General Organizational Science by A. Bogdanov, who, under other circumstances, could have been the leader and teacher of the world proletariat instead of Lenin. But in the period between the First Revolution of 1905 to 1907 and the First World War, he withdrew from party work. So, he wrote this General Organizational Science, which was published between 1917 and 1923. But it so happened that firstly, it was not the best time from the point of view of scientific discussions to conduct them, because the whole of Europe was concerned about the problems of the First World War and overcoming its consequences. And secondly, neither then nor now was the Russian language the language of world science. Therefore, the work that contained ideas that were not the easiest to understand remained either incomprehensible or unknown. And by 1948, there was already a global need to generalize some governorial experience. When Wiener wrote this book, the most ordinary PR campaign began on the theme, "The Great Wiener, New Science, and so on." But there is one more circumstance. According to Wiener's family legends, he is one of the descendants of Maimonides. This is a medieval Jewish theologian, a very authoritative person in certain circles. His works are still studied by adherents of Judaism, and this is one of the authorities of this confession. For this reason, it's clear that in biblical culture, preference is given to Norbert Wiener as the founder of the science of general theory of governance, but not to Bogdanov, as he was not involved in certain circles. The subsequent development of cybernetics proceeded in such a way that it was divided into applied directions: biological, technical, medical, and economic cybernetics appeared. Logically, if all this is real science, then, thanks to economic cybernetics, our economy should be flourishing, but it is not. And if you ask why it's not flourishing, it turns out that in the works of cyberneticians, economists, there is no determination in the answer. How is the setting of objectives of macroeconomic and microeconomic development carried out? And by what extra-social factors should this setting of objectives be conditioned in order for the economy to develop in harmony with nature? That is, cybernetics was originally a certain PR campaign. Since we had our own PR campaigns in the USSR, the evaluation of cybernetics as a pseudoscience was correct, and the reality is such that this is confirmed by history. But there may be objections on the theme that the persecution of cybernetics and cyberneticians led to the lag of the USSR in the sphere of computer technology, which we are still experiencing today. Such accusations are demagogy, behind which there stand no real facts, because the real facts are such that the State Committee on Science and Technology of the USSR and one of the commissions of the Academy of Sciences in 1968 killed all engineering, research and development schools, electronic design computing technology in the Soviet Union, having imposed on everyone, as an alternativeless variant, the American system IBM 360-370, which by that time had the age of 5 years from the moment the mass production of the machines began. In other words, the Academy of Sciences and the State Committee for Science and Technology of the USSR, by volitional order, having stepped on and trampled all dissent in engineering schools, eliminated design engineering, research and development, sui generis schools in this area, which led to the lag of the USSR in the sphere of computer technology and electronics, which has not really been overcome plainly up to the present time. Then the USSR collapsed, and there came such a fashionable word, management. It was necessary to translate a fragment from 2 thick books by Richardson's Strategic Management, published in London in 1999. The main difficulty in translating into Russian is conceptual non-determinateness. That is, the non-determinateness of the terminology of the source text and the absence of content in it.
Зачем это переводить?
Conditions were set that a fragment had to be translated in order to fulfill certain formal requirements. It turned out that there was no content, but there were conversations on peri-governorial themes. You see, when knowledge is not presented in a determined form, that is, the concepts are not determined, the terminology is ambiguous and partly metaphorical in character, then this has a certain merit in presenting information. This merit lies in the fact that people who read the text without comprehension are not able to understand what it's about. This is a kind of allegory, but a pseudo-scientific allegory. On the one hand, this is good, but on the other hand, it narrows the circle of those who could master the knowledge necessary for the activity. And the narrowing of the circle of competent governors in society is a potential catastrophe of society. When it's necessary to solve some governorial tasks, there will be no one to solve them. In principle, the catastrophe of the Russian Empire in 1917 and the catastrophe of the USSR in 1991 are the result of the fact that in both cases, the society did not have a sufficient number of professionally consistent cadres in governance. Therefore, despite the fact that the method of allegorical presentation of knowledge has certain merits, the accompanying shortcomings and vices are much more significant in the life of society if we consider it at historically long intervals of time. Because such texts produce a huge number of undereducated people who have mastered the lexicon, but are professionally inconsistent. And the fact that this is really so, in modern Russian culture, is expressed in the fact of the appearance of such a slang word as menagir, derived from a misreading of the English word manager. And we really do not need menagirs. We need qualified, professionally consistent governors who could govern processes in different spheres and areas of activity and could understand each other when they are engaged in complex projects. In this sense, the verdict of the Moscow court banning dead water as extremist material can be qualified as an act of high treason in the form of rendering assistance to foreign states and international organizations.
Давайте, наверное, поясним для тех, кто не знает, что такое мертвая вода.
Dead Water is a book in which the sufficiently general theory of governance was first set out, and from the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, the global historical process and some problems of governance towards various spheres of society, including the economy, were considered. According to the verdict of the Moscow court, the manifestation of interest in the problematics of social governance is extremism. But if we proceed from the interests of society, in the extremely widespread dissemination of governorial literacy, then this verdict is an act of treason, committed on the basis of collusion by a criminal group, and there are corresponding articles in the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation for this. And now let's move on to the theory of governance itself. I have already said that there are many theories of governance. For the most part, these are applied theories, focused on solving some kind of governorial tasks in these or those areas of activity. Mostly, this is technology. And since in technology, practice is the criterion of truth, this is an alternativeless way of detecting real professionals. Then, in these applied, narrow specialized theories of governance, everything is more or less favorable in relation to those spheres of activity that serve each of them. But then the question arises of how specialists in different spheres of activity can come to an agreement with each other. And the answer to this question presupposes the need to develop a sufficiently general theory of governance, general in the sense that it would be universal in the aspect of its application in various spheres of activity, thanks to which its abstractions could be filled by applied specialists in a mutually acceptable way, with real content, in the course of the carrying out of complex projects. Therefore, if we talk about the different theories of governance, then all theories of governance set the structure for the setting and solution of tasks of governance. What does this mean? This means that if we are within a certain sphere of activity, and several versions of theory of governance are oriented towards it, then these theories of governance will differ from each other in the structures of setting and solving governorial tasks, that is, in a set of concepts, the meaning of each of the concepts, and interconnections that exist constantly, or arise and dynamically change in the process of solving governorial tasks. What does this mean in applied aspects? In applied aspects, this betokens the circumstance that different theories set structures for setting, formulation, and solution of governorial tasks which have different effectiveness. That is, if, on the basis of one theory, you can solve a certain plurality of tasks, then, on the basis of another theory, you may be able to solve a wider plurality of tasks. And the differences of these pluralities will not be solvable on the basis of the first theory. What does this mean in a competitive environment? In the conditions of competition of many subjects of governance in one and the same sphere of activity, this means that those who use more advanced theories of governance will guaranteedly solve those tasks that cannot be solved by those who use less perfect theories of governance, or do not have any theories of governance at all, and are forced to solve governorial tasks somehow intuitively, based on common sense, and somehow differently in their concretics. It is for this reason that the prohibition that the Russian judicial system is trying to impose on the problematics of governance in terms of solving problems and tasks of social development is an extremely harmful thing. This is an anti-people thing. It is work for Russia's geopolitical opponents and her enemies.
Но это в том случае, если мертвая вода или достаточно общая теория управления действительно верны. Ведь вы говорите, что да, они работают хорошо, или вы так считаете, а на самом деле мы же не знаем, как.
In order to know how, it is not harmful to master this, and on the basis of this, to solve tasks. And if it's on the federal list of extremist materials, then when you refer to it, you are committing a crime. And after that, there is no need to talk about whether the theory of governance is perfect or imperfect. In other words, the question has been removed from the plane of social discussion into the plane of confrontation between various social groups on the question of social development. And it was not done by some independent extremists. It was done by one of the branches of state power, with a multitude of violations of the current legislation.
Запрещена же мертвая вода, а доту-то не запрещена.
There were also claims in relation to the sufficiently general theory of governance. If we talk about social governance, then Dead Water is the first widely published book in which the problematics of the life of society are considered from the standpoint of the theory of governance. And, accordingly, if there are any errors in Dead Water, then this thematics is a subject of scientific discussion, because errors can be revealed, and one can get rid of them only in the course of discussion. The inquisitorial approach, to hold it, not let it go, prohibit it. It does not solve problems, it conserves them. And now about the sufficiently general theory of governance. The history of the question is such that back in the Soviet times, the Institute for US and Canadian Studies commissioned from the Faculty of Applied Mathematics of Governance Processes research work on the theme the development of scenarios for relations between superpowers for the period up to 2005.
Тут, наверное, надо пояснить, что это наш институт, который изучал США и Канаду.
Yes, this is an institute of the USSR Academy of Sciences, which studied the United States and Canada. It still exists today and continues to study the United States and Canada.
Интересно, почему называется США и Канада, если Канада – это колония Англии вместе с Австралией? Почему отделено?
This question is not for me. This is a question for the founders of this institute and those who approved this name. The very formulation of the task, in the terms of technical assignment of the Institute for the US and Canadian Studies, the deputy director of which was then Andrei Kokoshin, later a well-known personality in Russian politics, he assumed mathematical modeling of formalized globally political processes on the basis of the instrumentarium of game theory. But it turned out that there are a number of questions that the game theory instrumentarium does not describe. One of these questions is, where do the rules of the game that describe the instrumentarium of game theory come from? How do they arise?
Честно говоря, странно. На теории каких игр хотели изучать соотношение двух огромных государств?
Of two blocks. Game theory is a branch of mathematics. This is not even probability theory. This is a branch of applied mathematics, game theory. This is a large direction in the development of mathematics, in which a lot of things are used from the mathematical apparatus, but it's oriented in applied questions towards evaluating the probability of winning a conflict by many opposing parties that are in the same environment. This is the essence. But it turned out that not everything in these situations can be modeled on the basis of the apparatus of game theory. The question about what to do arose. The answer to this question was the first edition of the sufficiently general theory of governance. How does it differ from strategic management, from management theory, from cybernetics? It differs in the fact that when it was written, we took care of the extremely precise demarcation of various concepts that are used to describe processes of governance and the possibility of an extremely accurate determination of the meaning of every one of the concepts when solving concrete applied tasks. Moreover, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, the concept of the entire function of governance is introduced. This concept is absent in cybernetics, in management theory, in particular narrow specialized applied versions of theories of governance. What is more, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, a very long, many-worded term is introduced. But in this term, there are no superfluous words. The stability of an object in terms of predictability of behavior to a certain measure under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance. The usual concept of stability, used in most areas of natural science and technology, as the ability of an object to return to its original mode of functioning after it's removed from this mode by an external disturbance. When this disturbance ceases to impact it, it turns out to be a particular case of stability of the object of governance in terms of the predictability of its behavior. Because that which from the point of view of the ordinary definition of stability is not stable, from the point of view of this concept, it can be stable in the sense of predictability of behavior, and in this case, it is possible to organize a process of governance. The majority of the technical versions of theory of governance deal with the structures in which there is complete determination, both in the aspect of composition and in the interconnections of the elements with each other, when they form a structure and function as a whole. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, the concept supersystem is introduced. A supersystem is a plurality of self-governed elements to which certain requirements are imposed. And this allows us to consider many processes that are seen outside the sufficiently general theory of governance as random, stochastic, ungovernable, as self-governed processes, or as processes governed from the outside on the basis of control parameters, which are certain statistics that describe these pluralities of elements. Thanks to these features, the conceptual apparatus of the sufficiently general theory of governance is such that it allows interpreting as processes of governance and self-governance, in general, any processes that exist in nature, in society, in technology, in the biosphere. It is precisely this circumstance that gave the name the sufficiently general theory of governance. The word sufficient, in this case, shows that for those who developed it, it is quite sufficient. And if someone finds that it is not sufficient enough to solve his tasks, then he can think and develop an even broader theory of governance, which will allow solving those tasks that can't be described within the framework of this theory. But in our opinion, the conceptual terminological apparatus of the sufficiently general theory of governance is such that it allows one to describe, in the quality of processes of governance, all processes in nature, in society, in technology. To date, there exist 3 editions of the sufficiently general theory of governance: the first edition of 1991, the second edition of 2004, and the third edition of 2010, which became the basis of the fundamentals of sociology, and on the basis of which the 2004 edition of the sufficiently general theory of governance was revised, having formed the edition of 2011. The presentation of the sufficiently general theory of governance in fundamentals of sociology and in some preliminary materials of the training course of the sufficiently general theory of governance is contently different in one thing. In the preliminary materials of the training course, a separate section is devoted to the processes in supersystems. In fundamentals of sociology, the question of supersystems is touched upon in the minimum volume necessary for a person to have an idea of what structureless governance is and what governance on the basis of virtual structures is. Practice shows that, unfortunately, most of today's youth do not have a breadth of outlook that allows them to immediately understand the section of the sufficiently general theory of governance, which is devoted to processes in supersystems. For this reason, this section was excluded from the fundamentals of sociology, and this was only indicated for those who are interested in mastering this section or will remember what should be mastered, where he could get acquainted with these materials. Let's move on to the sufficiently general theory of governance itself, to its content. The original concept is the entire function of governance. If a person has a clear understanding of what the entire function of governance is, then, in principle, he is able to expand the entire sufficiently general theory of governance from this concept with any degree of detailedness that he needs. What is all that he needs for this? He must have an idea of what the structure of modern science is like. Metaphorically speaking, modern science is a tree of cognition that sits in the soil. The soil is objective reality, that is, the world as such, plus texts inherited from past eras. The root system of this tree is the methodology of cognition and creativity. In other words, it is dialectics that is genetically programmed for man by virtue of the peculiarities of the psyche that he can carry. Further, from the roots goes the trunk. Since all applied scientific disciplines solve certain governorial tasks, the trunk is the sufficiently general theory of governance. And the crown is the whole set of applied scientific disciplines that exist to date. And on the border of the trunk, and each branch, sits metrology, that is, the study of how abstractions and theories of each applied scientific discipline are connected with real life. And philosophy in this system plays the role of a gardener who deals with this tree and grows it. That is, if philosophy is adequate, the tree grows normally, does not bear poisonous fruits. If philosophy is not normal, then the tree grows crookedly. Among the fruits, some are poisonous. If we talk about the system of education, then the right system of education in a nraviously and intellectually healthy society should give a complete picture of objective reality, both about the tree of cognition and about the gardener who takes care of this tree and nurtures it. If you look at our system of education, then our system of education gives an idea of individual branches divorced from the trunk and suggests jumping from branch to branch like macaques in solving various kinds of interdisciplinary tasks. In fact, we don't have the right science that allows society to live well, and we don't have the right system of education that allows producing functionally capable professional cadres for all sectors and spheres of society. The entire function of governance is a sequential collection of successive stages. It begins with the detection of that factor of the environment that puts pressure on the psyche of the governor, causes discomfort, and thereby causes a subjective need to organize governance in relation to this factor. Here, though, there immediately arises the question: If we are talking about the first stage of the entire function, then what to govern? The answer is simple. Does the factor really exist, or did you fall for some kind of illusion of the existence of the factor? Depending on the answer to this question, there will be certain consequences, because if you fell for an illusion, then the reality is such that only real processes can be governed. And if you fell for an illusion and aspire to govern an illusory process that is not in objective reality, then your disappointment will be very real when you reach the collapse of the process of governance. Next stage. We live in society. If the problem has a massive impact on a multitude of people, then there are two variants. You put every person before the need to carry out the first stage of the entire function of governance, that is, to detect the problem. What does it mean to detect the problem? This means describing it with a finite set of metrologically consistent features. And as practice shows, far from everyone can solve this problem. In particular, when I spoke about fascism, Umberto Eco named 14 features of fascism. Britt also named 14 characteristics of fascism, and they do not coincide. That is, in order to save people from the need to spend time on going through the first stage of the entire function of governance, the problem must be described, metrologically consistent with a finite set of features. And accordingly, the society must develop the skill of detecting this problem, that is, a stereotype. So, this happens, the second stage is over. Stage 3, the question arises, what to do with this problem? What do you want from this problem? And the answer to this question, what do you want, is, in essence, setting of objectives. That is, you must decide what objectives should be achieved in relation to this problem as a result of the implementation of the process of governance. And these objectives must also be metrologically consistent. Because the answer to the question, what do you want? I want everything to be good. This again leads us to the anecdote about Carabas Barabas, from the point of view of whom it is good that Buratino is burning in the fireplace, on the oven tortilla soup is boiling, and so on. This, from his point of view, is good. But from the point of view of Buratino, to all appearances, all this is very bad. Therefore, the question of what is good, here it does not work. And it's required to answer this question metrologically consistently. That is, all objectives must be described in measurable or organoleptically recognizable parameters. Further, in the majority of cases, the process of governance, in relation to a new problem, supplements the processes of governance that already flowed in the past in relation to other problems. And therefore, the objectives in relation to the new problem, there may be more than one objective, must in some way be coordinated with each other and coordinated with those objectives in relation to which governance is already being carried out, because the vector of objectives can be internally conflicting. There is a saying about this: the wolves are fed and the sheep are safe. And what is left in the defaults? The fact that the wolves ate one of the shepherds, thanks to which the sheep are safe and the wolves are fed. So, the conflict of the vector of objectives can generate side effects that will be unacceptable for the governor. In English language literature, this kind of phenomenon is called the monkey's paw effect. The story The Monkey's Paw was written by American writer W. W. Jacobs, where a dried monkey paw was an object of power from the point of view of magic, and was able to fulfill the wishes of its owner. But these wishes were always accompanied by some concomitant effects that devalued the achieved result. Or, in other words, what we reap, that we sow. And if setting of objectives has happened, then what is required? The formation of a conception of governance is required. What is it for? If you can go directly up to the door and close it, this is your objective of governance. Then the process of approaching the door and closing it can be bracketed and not considered a governing action, although this is an action anyway. But, nevertheless, you can do it directly. But if you can't go up directly to the door, but still want to close it, what to do?
Кому-то сказать.
Tell someone, find some kind of stick that can reach the door and close it. In general, it turns out that in the overwhelming majority of cases, we cannot directly impact those parameters, those factors of the environment, the factors that characterize the object and which are included in the vector of objectives of governance. Or it's fraught with some wild difficulties that render the process meaningless. But at the same time, we can impact some other factors directly. And a change in those factors will entail a change in those that are included in the vector of objectives. Although it's many-worded, it's understandable. We cannot directly impact what we want to change, but what we can impact will somehow impact what we can't impact, and will bring it to the state we want.
Наверное, как пояснение, правильно это будет или нет, армия не может взять город, в лобовую, да? Там же большие стены, хорошие пушки, но зато они ищут, значит, предателей, которые открывают ночью ворота.
Yes, that's it. The army gets inside. Or in a car. We want to rotate the wheels, but for that we need a big system in the form of steering. Being in the car, we cannot directly impact the wheels, but we can rotate the steering wheel or some other steering manipulator, and through the system of governance, we will rotate the wheels in the direction we need. If we could impact everything directly, then we would simply have no need in any theories of governance. And since we cannot impact most things directly, there is a need for theories of governance. And one of the elements of the theory of governance is the question of building a general conception of governance, which would integrate a particular conception of governance in relation to those objectives that are connected with the detection at the entire stage of the entire function of governance, connected with problems. Is it understandable?
Ну, в целом, да.
As a whole, understandable. We have some processes of governance that come from the past. We have a certain conception of governance that describes the totality of these processes of governance and interconnections. It is called the general conception of governance. And we must develop a particular conception of governance in relation to the newly detected problem in such a way that it fits into this very general conception of governance. And then there arises the question of introducing the general conception of governance into life, because in words you can talk about a lot of things, and even if these words are correct and the recipes are correct, but they are not adopted for implementation, then troubles connected with the problem will take place, and they will have to be overcome. And in this regard, let us again turn to the subjects of Russian folk tales. In them, Baba Yaga is not always a bad character, because in some tales, Baba Yaga is the mother of Vasilisa the Wise.
Да, а еще в достаточно большом количестве сказок она ничего плохого не делает.
Да.
Добрый молодец к ней приходит,
Да,
она его кормит, поет в
добрый
баньке.
молодец к ней приходит.
Yes, a Dobrious fellow comes to her, she allows him to rest, and then conversations about the problem begin. As for the Dobrious fellows in Russian folk tales, things are pretty bad. Why? Because Baba Yaga demonstrates for them the prospects. If you go there, you will meet someone. He will offer you this. Your task is to send him there. As a result, there will be a positive effect. Understood? Understood. The Dobrious fellow goes there, in accordance with the instructions, comes to place X, meets subject Y, and instead of sending the subject in the direction indicated by Baba Yaga, he falls for something done by the subject. As a result, the effect is negative. And the Dobrious fellow returns to Baba Yaga and begins a conversation. Well, you went? I went. You met him? I met him. You sent him? Yes, no, you see, I... Well, what did you do? Fool. Well, fine, have a rest. The morning is wiser than the evening. In the morning, the same again. You go there, meet someone, send him there. There will be a positive effect. And again, the same thing. And only on the third attempt, remembering the two negative effects, he sends the subject where it's needed and achieves a positive effect. This means that the conception of governance should be implemented in life. If it is not implemented in life, then even if it's life consistent, realistically achievable, then troubles are inevitable. The conception has been implemented into life. What does this practically mean? This means that structures have been deployed that will carry out governance in accordance with the conception. The necessary informational algorithmic support is embedded into the structures. And there is a provision of these structures with energy and other material technical factors necessary for the realization of the conception. Returning from these abstractions to the practice of life, the art of governance consists in the following. First, the distribution of sole personal responsibility for these or those stages or fragments of a common to all cause. In the giving of the person to whom sole personal responsibility is entrusted the necessary powers in relation to the governance towards those processes that are connected with this fragment of the common cause. Third, the provision of him with resources of various kinds, without which the achievement of the objectives of a fragment of this cause is impossible. If these three aspects are fulfilled, then everything is going well. And if we turn to history, then yes, Stalin and Beria were outstanding governors of the mega-level and macro-level, since they successfully solved these three tasks: distribution of responsibility, distribution of powers, and distribution of resources. And after the general conception has been implemented, what remains? It remains to monitor the functioning of those structures that carry the conception of governance. Since practice may in some way not coincide with expectations, then, in the course of control, there may be a need to perfect the current conception of governance and modify the corresponding structures that carry it. After the objectives of governance are achieved, this is the final stage of the entire function of governance, then there are two variants. Either the liquidation of the structures that have fulfilled their role and the freeing up of resources that were employed in them for use in other processes of governance, or maintaining the structures in a functionally operable condition if there is an expectation that it will be necessary to solve the same tasks of governance in the future. Thus, it turns out that the entire function of governance, with such a quite rough method of detailedness, includes 8 stages: detecting a factor of the environment, setting of objectives, forming a skill in order to recognize that factor in the future, setting of objectives in relation to the problem, forming a general conception of governance, introducing the general conception of governance into life, monitoring the flow of the process of governance, perfecting the conception of governance, and then either the liquidation or maintenance of the structure in a functionally operable condition until the next time. If you look at all this, then the first impression is that I said nothing new that you don't know. But the paradox is that if you turn to a theory of governance aside from the sufficiently general theory of governance, then you will find that the description of processes of governance in all applied theories does not begin with the detection of problems, not from the first stage of the entire function of governance, but somewhere in the middle. It turns out that by default it's assumed that all tasks related to the first stages of the entire function of governance seem to already have been solved. To what does this lead in practice? Let's say you have a conception of governance towards an object, which is generated by someone somehow, and you are going to govern what you have on its basis. The reality is such that everything that you have, plus the circumstances in which it's located, and the parameters of the environment with which it interacts, are not what they were when the conception that you took by default as a ready-made recipe was being worked out. To what will this lead? This will lead to errors of governance. Moreover, it can lead to very nasty errors of governance of such a kind that you will be very good at governing the process based on the borrowed conception, not in your own interest, however, but in the interest of whoever gave you this conception. An example, known to everyone from childhood, is the tail, tops, and roots. What is this about? The bear accepts the conception of governance from the man, and the bear plows. He plows perfectly. In this aspect, there are no complaints about the bear. But, in the end, the man gets all the positive effects, and the bear gets only these tops. Moreover, no matter what it does, by strength of the fact that the bear does not solve the tasks connected with the first stages of the entire function of governance, the man always wins. If we turn to our days, the liberal market economic model appeared, and the system of education was tailored for it. The Constitution was written, all the current legislation was written for this liberal market model. The question is, where is the positive effect?
А какой эффект, если мы колония?
We are a colony, because there is no positive effect, and because the liberal market model, contrary to all declarations of the liberals and its adherents, is precisely oriented towards making Russia a colony and towards the fact that the Russian economy would work not for the population of Russia, but for others. Why? Because both in Marxist sociology and in foreign Western sociology, society is not considered from the standpoint of a theory of governance, but all cultures, be it a primitive relic culture that lives on the basis of the Stone Age somewhere in Africa or somewhere else, or any of the modern, highly developed in technological terms societies, all these cultures differ from each other in one thing: how, in every one of them, the entire function of governance is implemented, or how it's not implemented in them. And then another question arises. What stages of the entire function are implemented in this society, and what stages are implemented somewhere outside of it, and in whose interests are they implemented? That is, despite the banality of everything that's included in the entire function of governance, practice shows that if this concept is absent, and governance is described starting from some stages of the entire function of governance, then negative consequences are inevitable. Before introducing the concept of the entire function of governance, I usually ask the audience questions about how they understand governance. The most typical answers to this question boil down to there being a certain organization, and the organization has a boss. The boss gives out directives, and there in the organization, people fulfill these directives, and this is governance. Guys, and how did the organization arise? For what tasks? Why did it arise precisely with such and such a structure and not with some other structure? Practice shows that the absence of understanding of the entire function of governance leads to dire consequences. Therefore, this is a necessary concept, and the theory of governance really unfolds with whichever detailedness, necessary in concretics, from the entire function of governance. So, if a person understands what the entire function of governance is, then I don't have to speak on, because he is able to guess everything else by himself, if he thinks. After the entire function of governance, I named the many-worded term, the stability of an object in terms of the predictability of behavior to a certain measure under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance. In essence, this is a detailed formulation of the aphorism attributed now to Napoleon, now to someone else. To foresee is to govern. This is unprovable. It can be considered axiomatic. A person can govern only those objects whose behavior for him is predictable. If behavior is predictable for one person, but not for another, then the one for whom it is predictable, in principle, can govern, and the one for whom it's not predictable cannot govern. The question of setting of objectives and the question of the formation of a conception of governance turn out to be connected with the solution of the task of stability of the object in terms of the predictability of its behavior in the process of governance. What are the examples of solving this task? We have all seen, either in real life or in the movies, rotor system helicopters. One main rotor and another rotor on the tail, a control one. This is called rotor system helicopters. The laws of aerodynamics are such that if the blades are rigidly fixed in the rotor hub and you try to take off in the helicopter will collapse, either in a gust of wind or starting to move. Why? Because some blades run into the air when the rotor rotates, while other blades run out of the airstream. And since the aerodynamic force is proportional to the speed of the incident flow to the second degree, then, on those blades that move in the direction of the helicopter flight, the lifting force is greater than on those blades that go towards the tail, in the direction opposite to the flight. Accordingly, a heeling moment occurs, and the helicopter should capsize and fall. So it was during the first attempts to make a helicopter. In Russia, B.N. Yuriev invented a device that was called the swash plate. This device changes the angle of inclination of the blades and rotor during their circular motion. Thanks to this, the heeling moment is leveled, and the force vector that arises on the rotor can be directed in any direction. And by virtue of this, the helicopter can fly forward, sideways, and backwards with the corresponding governance. And the rotor on the tail compensates for the reactive moment that arises on the fuselage of the helicopter because of the rotation of the rotor. If we correlate with the theory of governance, then Yuryev solved the task of helicopter stability in terms of predictability of behavior. And the object that was obviously unstable, in the usual understanding of the concept of stability, turned out to be stably governable. This is not the only case when the solution of the task of stability of the behavior of an object in terms of predictability of behavior allowed and allows the introduction of inherently unstable objects and processes into stable modes of governance. Another example, hydrofoils. Meteor's rockets, which are known to our rivers, are semi-submerged hydrofoils. The wing scheme of semi-submerged wings has the following feature. When the wing floats up, the lifting force on it falls and sinks. If it sinks too deep, then the lifting force on it increases and pushes the wing to the surface. Thanks to these features of the semi-submerged hydrofoils, rockets' meteors can move stably in the wing mode. But the problem of seaworthiness arises. If there are waves, then the waves beat against the bottom of the meteor, the wings fly up to the surface. There is a risk of breaking. But one wants to fly over the surface, over the rough sea. What to do? It would seem, what can be simpler than this? Make the racks higher, the wings go under the water, under the profile of the wave, the body goes over the crests of the wave. But no. It turns out that when the wing leaves the surface of the water, this effect disappears. And in order for the hydrofoil to move in wing mode across the rough sea on fully submerged wings, we need a system of automatic governance that would govern the lifting force on the wings, depending on the parameters of the movement of the boat. Such schemes exist, and there are hydrofoils which can move in the wing mode at high speed in the conditions of rather strong waves. This is also an example of solving the task of stability of behavior of an object in terms of predictability of behavior. In this term, in its full name, there really are no superfluous words, for the simple reason that the predictability of the behavior of an object is required to a certain measure, because this measure, on the one hand, is dictated by the tasks themselves, and, on the other hand, is conditioned by the apparatus that we use to solve the task of prognostics. In military affairs, it is simply understandable. If there is a megaton in a warhead, then the accuracy of behavior, hitting, plus or minus half a kilometer is sufficient. If there is no megaton in the warhead, but hundreds of kilograms of TNT, then the hit is required to be more accurate. But these are also other requirements for the accuracy of the prognosis and the accuracy of governance towards the carrier in the process of delivering the gift to the target. To put it differently, the determination of the measure with which the prognostics should be carried out, these are not invented words. It is actually a vital need. In the same way, in a number of cases, the external environment exerts such an impact that it must be taken into account in prognosing, because before the advent of jet aviation, all record-long range flights were connected, in one or another way, with weather forecasting, because the speed of the aircraft was compatible with the speed of a strong wind. And if the forecast was unfavorable in terms of wind, then the range record could not be made. That is, the external environment can also be a factor for which the process of governance is critical. There may be internal changes in the object itself, which are very critical for the process of governance and the consequences. During the battle for Moscow, there occurred a number of catastrophes of the SB bombers in aviation bases. By this time, the SB had been in operation for several years and was considered a completely reliable, well-designed aircraft. All these catastrophes, which occurred in the winter of 1941 in the Moscow region, had one thing in common. After a cold, frosty night, in the morning a plane accelerated, took off from the runway, and fell with a full bomb load. The question arose, why? It turned out that in that cold, frosty night, needle ice had covered the wings of the aircraft. That is, the needles of ice were perpendicular to the surface of the wing, and this ice spoiled the aerodynamics of the aircraft so much that thanks to the ground effect, it had enough force to lift off the ground. But as soon as it went to such a height where the ground did not increase the lifting force, it fell down like a stone. After that, before all such flights, they began to simply brush their wings with a broom. There were no more catastrophes. Apparently, the junior Borovik also died on the YAK-40, which took off and fell. And before that, there was a frosty night, and there could have been some needle ice. And if it fell asymmetrically, then the lifting force of the right and left wings, beyond the influence of the ground, could have been so different that the pilots failed to hold the plane in the air. That is, internal changes in the object itself can also be critical. Further, governance itself. If we don't foresee the consequences of how the object of governance will react to our actions which we consider to be governorial, then we will not be able to govern it. Or, if something suddenly happens to the object, it breaks down, as a result of which the previous mode and method of governance turn out to be impossible. This is from the same ballpark as, God forbid, the steering malfunctions on the move. Now I have to draw something. In the process of governance, information circulates in some way. The way information circulates is represented by this scheme. SG means System of Governance. Below there is a rectangle that says Object. Both the object and the system of governance are situated in an environment with which they are in some way interconnected and with which they interact. There are arrows that go from the system of governance into the object and the environment. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, these are feed-forward lines, and the arrows that go from the environment and the object into the system of governance are feedback lines. From the point of view of the classics, this definition is incorrect, because from the point of view of the classics, feed-forward lines go only into the object from the system of governance, and feedback lines go only from the object into the system of governance. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, the concept of feed-forward and feedback lines is extended on account of the fact that feed-forward lines go not only into the object, but also into the environment. And feedback lines go from the environment into the system of governance. Why is this extension made? The extension is made because, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, it is possible to consider processes when other subjects can be in the environment with aspirations to govern the subject. Then their governing impact enters along feedback lines into the system of governance we are considering. And the subject, who is in the environment, receives information about the system of governance and the object through feed-forward lines. To put it differently, from the point of view of the subject who is in the environment, the feed-forward lines of the first subject become feedback lines, and the feedback lines become feed-forward ones. In addition, the connection between the object and the system of governance, enclosed onto each other by feed-forward and feedback lines, is usually called an enclosed system. In the theory of governance, the term enclosed system differs from a similarly sounding term in physics. In physics, a closed system is a system that is isolated from the outside world and the environment. And in the theory of governance, the enclosedness of the system is its connection. The connection of the object with the system of governance towards the contours of feed-forward and feedback lines. What is more, if you look at the practice of governance, then, contrary to the classics where it's believed that feed-forward lines go only into the object and feedback lines go only from the object, the reality is such that in the majority of processes of governance, feed-forward lines also go into the environment. For example, if you are driving a car and you want no one to drive into you, then it's useful to blink a turn signal before turning. This has nothing to do with governance towards the trajectory of your car, but it has a certain impact on the environment and other subjects in it, which guarantees a higher level of safety for both you and them. In the same way, when the car is moving, you look not only at the position of the steering wheel and what's happening on the panel, but you also look at what's happening in the mirrors, windscreens, side windows. For uniformity, it was easier for us to name them feed-forward lines, the set of lines going from the system of governance into the object and environment, and feedback lines, the set of informational flows that go from the object into the system of governance and from the environment into the system of governance. Further arises the question about the structuring of information in the processes of governance. Here is the picture again. On the left side, there is a column of inscriptions. The first I want, the second I want, the third I want, and so on, the nth I want. This is the vector of objectives. Further, the vector of the current state of the enclosed system, each I want, corresponds to the inscription reality as such. That is, the reality can be very different from what we want. And the task of governance is to bring reality into full correspondence with what we want. But by strength of the fact that in the majority of cases, we cannot directly impact the parameters included in the vector of objectives, the dimensionality of the vector of current state increases, and, on account of this, a certain number of lines appear under it. Under the analog of vector of objectives, which completely corresponds to the vector of objectives, line by line, we have some more lines. What is included in these lines? First, these lines include that on which we build the governing impact, and this can be called the vector of governing impact. It includes those factors on which we can have a direct impact, and when they begin to change, their change will entail a change in the desired by us direction of those parameters that correspond line by line to the parameters of the vector of governance. What's more, there are a number of parameters that we do not impact, at least in those modes of governance that are considered in this task. These parameters are included in the model that describes the behavior of objects in interaction with the environment. But any of their values are recognized as acceptable in those modes of governance for which the task is being solved. Thus, the vector of current state includes three groups of parameters. The first group fully corresponds in structure to the vector of objectives of governance. The second group of parameters are governing impacts, and the third group of parameters are free parameters. The difference between the vector of objectives and the vector of current state, this is the vector of error of governance. The task of governance can be formulated in two ways. Either to nullify the vector of error, or to ensure the equality of the vector of objectives and the vector of current state in the first lines, which are completely mutually correspondent with each other. The conception of governance describes the circulation and transformation of information included in all three of these vectors in the process of governance. I propose to stop on this today, because this is the most general of what can be said, and further we can engage ourselves with more detailedness in all the stages of the entire function of governance, the features of these vectors, and everything else that relates to this problematics.